Works. All right. Thank you guys for coming out, and I want to thank B-Sides Augusta. This is the awesomest place I've found so far to speak because it's also slick, it's also prepared, it's also nice. So today I wanted to kind of attack the premise of detecting lateral movement from the perspective where we don't have network data. So a lot of the stuff that you see at Security Onion Con, see here, the last talk, we all assume that you have network data. We assume that you have Bro, something like that you're going to be able to look at. You know, what if you happen to have $10 for detection and, you know, Bro costs 15, and then you can pick an endpoint sensor, or you can do something that's just a little bit more cost effective in the short term and then squeeze that investment out. So that's something I wanted to try to tackle from that perspective. My name's Tony. I work for Red Canary. We do a little bit of managed detection and response. I have an endpoint bias. All the data I look at on a daily basis, 95% of my time is in an EDR product, some sort of endpoint data. So most of the stuff that I know to talk about is endpoint data. If you set me in front of a Bro sensor, I'm going to be a little bit lost, and then I have to catch up. So before I came over here, I used to be a systems administrator. I used to teach on the side as well. Loved to be able to teach. Hated grading homework. So they let me come and do conferences and all this good stuff, so I don't have to grade homework anymore. And when I was a systems administrator, I kind of had a really interesting feeling most of the time. You know, you think, especially when you're a junior admin kind of going into things, when you don't realize what you don't know yet, that you're running all of these services on your network. You think, I am the boss. I know exactly what's going on. I have my DNS. I have my remote desktop stuff floating around. I am the consumer of my network. What you don't really notice is everything else. I'll be honest, I stole this from the marketing folks because it really did apply to this. What I didn't realize when I was a junior admin going on into, regular admin was that I probably wasn't the only consumer of services on my network. I wasn't the only person that was going to be using Windows Remote Management. I wasn't the only person that was going to be using Remote Desktop, anything like that. So I really kind of had a little bit of a view, and what I really didn't know that I needed at the time was a lot larger view. At the time, we didn't have any network IDS detection stuff, so we were kind of blind in that sense. So if we, knowing what I know now a little bit of piecing some of this together, would have been really handy to figure out who else was consuming services on my network. So if we're going to be talking about endpoint data, we have to define what endpoint data is. Exactly what are we going to be talking about? Yeah, I spend most of my time in an EDR, but you don't have to have EDR. You can do this with all sorts of different kinds of data. And they sometimes replace one another, sometimes they're complementary. It just depends on what you're going for. And we're going to talk about a few lateral movement techniques that are ripped from the headlines off of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And we're going to go through some straightforward ways that you can detect each of these techniques with just using event logs, a little bit of EDR if you have that in your environment, something like that. So the first kind of endpoint data I wanted to talk about was log data. Logs are really easy to talk about. They're really easy to gather. Well, I don't want to say easy to gather. They're easy to generate because logs, everything has a default logging, and the catch is they integrate with everything, but they have so many options. You have to figure out what are the right configurations. When you have something that's logging out of the box, is it logging the right thing for your environment? A lot of times people have to tune it. I'll give you a good example of this. At my old gig as an admin, I used to have a Citrix NetScaler load balancer in my environment. What I didn't realize is that the load balancing, when I was load balancing to web servers, was messing up my web server logs because I was getting the IP address of the load balancer instead of the intended client. So there were so many configuration options, there's so many different integrations, all these different things. You have to figure out how to get the right one for you. But if you get it down right, your security operations folks can absolutely log everything in their environment and give you a heads up as an incident responder, as a detection personnel, to let you know that something is going on. There are lots of folks who can substitute logs for multi-thousand million-dollar products if you know how to do it. So Kind of what's in the middle of this, endpoint detection and response, these are going to be products that look at process metadata in some way. Let's imagine that instead of having a Windows event log, you have kind of a flight recorder for your computer that tells you what network connections, file modifications a process made, keeps track of some of the auditing information for that process. Catches, these solutions are often hard to manage. You don't get content with them. You see that notepad.exe executed. You would see the notepad.exe modified a file, but you don't know what's in the file. You might see the PowerShell.exe spawned a script, but you don't know what's in the script. You have to make some deductions based on what the PowerShell behavior does. This is really good for processes. If you're going to be doing file integrity monitoring or some other kind of detection technique, this gets a lot harder. But you can do some of that with event logs and some of your more advanced group policy settings. And the far end on what I call the hardest side of things is going to be live forensics capabilities. I'm going to assume we're not going to talk about dead box forensics because that's a whole nother discussion unto itself. But live forensics is really good about giving you visibility. Let's assume you can get a memory capture. You can see everything that's running on a computer. You can see all the memory. You can see code injections, unparalleled visibility. The catch is, it's hard to scale. Try doing hunting in memory across thousands upon thousands of endpoints, running server 2019, 2016, whatever, especially when you have to, have CentOS servers in your environment where you have to do a profile for volatility for everyone, all this different mess that goes with it. That gets really painful really fast. You'll have somebody spending all of their day trying to scale things rather than investigating. There's a lot of human correlation involved with forensics. Typically, a lot of the processing can be automated, but you don't know what you're looking for yet until you spot it sometimes with a forensics investigation. And then once if you find things with a forensics investigation, you can expand that out to do a targeted hunt across the rest of the enterprise. And sometimes forensics has an issue with ephemeral activity. So let's imagine you have a process that spawns really quickly, goes away after a few seconds. You'll probably be able to see that the process spawned. You may not be able to tell what it did during a forensic investigation afterwards. You'll probably be able to tell from prefetch files, something like that, that something has happened, but you don't know exactly what. That is something that some of your Windows event logs, EDR sensors will be a little bit better at, catching some of your ephemeral activity. One quick note. Some of you have probably used Sysmon in the past, and Sysmon is kind of a hybrid sort of situation where it does some of the duties of an EDR project and some of the duties of Windows logging. I'm going to count Sysmon in this as Windows logging, even though some of our tips for the EDR side of life can also apply to Sysmon once you've collected those logs. So I'll get into some of the techniques. First technique I wanted to cover was Windows administrative shares. These are going to be hidden network shares that are used for Windows administration. Typically, this technique is cheating a little bit because this isn't a just pure one and done sort of technique to move laterally from one system to another. It's really usually a two-part technique. There's usually a file copy followed shortly after by some sort of scheduled execution. You can't copy the file and count it as lateral movement because the file has to execute on the other system. So, and you can't execute the file on the other system unless it's transferred. So it has to be kind of a two-part thing. Typically, when the shares that you'll see, usually they're going to be like $ shares, like $, admin $. The one we see most often when doing incident response scenarios is going to be the admin $ share. And when we look at the copy activity, a few event logs always get generated. So we'll definitely have 5140s, 5145s. These are going to be event logs that tell you something has been touched. A network share has been contacted, and a network share, a user has checked to see if they have permissions to contact this share. It's not necessarily definitive yet. You have to still go and see, did the file copy, get your confirmation of that. But you're able to tell that somebody has been snooping around. And the other kind of event ID that we're going to focus on in this is a 4624. This is going to be a account logged on sort of event, a successful logon. The interesting one with this is going to be a logon type 3. If you've ever looked through the logon types for Microsoft for the 4624 events, there's a whole lot of logon types. There's 2 for interactive, 10 for remote desktop, all these different things. We're going to see 4624s with a logon type 3 several times in this session, because this is the one that says, I'm a network logon. It's not interactive. I don't have a shell. It's just, I'm authenticating over the network. This is what we see with SMB sort of things. To actually schedule the execution as a service, there are also some more logs that we can look at. And before I did the service part, if you're going to be looking at trying to find this copy operation from an EDR sensor, like if you happen to be using Tanium, something else in your environment, something like that, you may not see this copy, simply because the sensor that does the copy this computer that does the copy is going to need to have a sensor on it. So let's imagine that you have a sensor on your victim PC, but you don't have one on the attacking computer. You're going to see a file get written, like in the master file table for your victim system, but your endpoint sensor may not see that file getting written because it doesn't have anything writing it there. We've seen stuff like that a lot with carbon black sensors, with other sort of products like that. So for the service execution, the main event log that you're going to look for is under the system log, you're going to look for an event ID 7045. It's going to be a new service. Let's see. Usually, this is something where malware will schedule a service to execute, and it says, I really want to, stay persistent here. And under that event log, you'll see what the service name is, all the different configuration information for that service. It just works out really wonderfully. If you happen to be using an EDR product, you can still spot service execution, even if you don't have like all of your event logs getting collected. If you look for child processes of services.exe, you'll be able to see the things that are running as services on your network. Something that's really interesting is this doesn't just apply to Windows admin shares. This also applies to things where an attacker will leave a persistent script, persistent shell command, something like that, that's on one system where they're not even moving around. This just happens to play a dual role. And so actually, before I move too far into it, who knows what Windows admin tool commonly uses this? Which one? Exactly. So the answer is psexec. So that leads me into the next one. Almost there. All right. And if you're looking at the live forensics for Windows administrative shares, your strategy for the copy and the service execution is going to be relatively similar. You're going to look for new files that have been created within a Windows folder. You're going to look for services that have been registered in the Windows registry. If the attacker deletes your service, you're going to have to do a little bit of deleted data recovery. You may need to go try to find deleted registry keys, something like that. That's something that's other tools will be really good at. But if you're just kind of coming in on the back end of things and you don't have other tools in place, you can definitely find this from the live forensics perspective. Since we talked about psexec, since we mentioned that, I wanted to kind of include a little bit of a bonus about psexec. Psexec is an admin tool that has just worked for years. Everybody grew up with it, everybody's used to it, and it works via Windows administrative shares. It copies, schedules a service, executes it. The really cool thing about it is it starts talking back to its original host, its adversary host, using named pipes. So if you happen to have sysmon in your environment and you happen to be monitoring named pipes, you can go find all of your psexec activity. If you've banned psexec on your network and you see these named pipes, you can instantly get a ticket up, go get your incident handlers and say, go look at this, something's wrong. Something I didn't realize until like a year or so ago, that there are all of these clones for psexec as well. Let's say you've banned PSExec on your network and you don't want anybody using it. Bad guys can bring other versions of PSExec into your network, something like remcom, PAExec, or CSExec. So remcom and PAExec are, well, all three of those are open source solutions. The last one is something that's written in C#. PAExec is supposed to be like the open source version of PSExec that you can actually include with other utilities. And remcom is one that we see not really used legitimately with a lot of things, but has the same functionality as PSExec. And before you think that this is a typo, it's not. If you go look at the source code for remcom, it's trivially easy to change like the named pipes for communication, but bad guys don't. It's literally like one single file that says change these, and people will just compile it and use it, and you can look for this misspelling of communication inside your named pipes and find it. So the next one is Windows Remote Management, mainly because you can't sit in front of all your systems at the same time. You can't have an interactive logon, especially if all your servers are virtual. You can't, go out there to your data center and pull out a card every time you want to log on to something. So Windows Remote Management lets you admin all of your systems, lets you do it from the comfort of your desk, and lets you figure out, the best way to get everything done. It has several parts. The really cool thing about all of this is that if you've ever looked at a product that does agentless managing, ever bought a product that says you don't need to install an agent, everything works without one, it uses this technology. Really cool thing, well, not so cool thing about it as well, is that your bad guys also have the agentless way to manage your environment. So if you can do it, they can do it. So there are a few different commands that we'll cover. WinRM will configure how Windows Remote Management works. It can also call WMI commands. Something that it shouldn't really be doing, but it has the capability. I have no idea why. WinRS, this is a tool that's built into Windows, been built into it for years that lets you just execute commands remotely. It's typically what people start off with PSExec, then they realize they don't need PSExec, they can just use WinRS, and they start climbing that ladder a little bit. That's what happened with my senior admin whenever I was at the college. WMI is a management technology inside Windows that has its tentacles into everything. It lets you query dang near anything you want about the system. You can learn how much disk space you have, what CPU you have. You can also spawn processes, figure out everything you want about a system, and also be able to do a little bit extra. WMI is a really common way to move things around on a network, or I say call processes on another system on a network. Tell you about one cool case where we saw some of this. And then PowerShell Remoting is kind of the final technology that has built on top of this, and it's really what I tell people, if you're using PSExec in your environment or using an older management technology, do PowerShell Remoting instead, because we'll go over a few logs that'll make it easier for you to see what's going on here as opposed to just letting PSExec run rampant in your environment. So for the WinRS one in particular, we're going to be looking for a couple of log entries. Again, that 4624 shows up, another log on type 3. It's not going to be interactive, not remote desktop. It's going to be somebody saying, I am here and I'm on the network. And we're going to have a ID 169, which shows that a user has authenticated to WinRM. It doesn't tell you what they did. It just says, hey, I am here, this is the service I'm using, and here's where I came from. That's pretty much it. If you happen to be using Sysmon or an EDR type product, you can tell a little bit more about what has happened. If you look for child processes of winrshost.exe, you can see what an attacker has run in your environment from WinRS. If you want to tell whether or not somebody is sending commands to other things, you can just look for WinRS with a -R, and everything that comes after, and what comes after that -R is going to be, your remote host, and then what's after that is going to be the commands that they ran. So for Windows Management Instrumentation, WMI, like I said, this has a lot of tentacles everywhere. If you've been following any pen testers, you've probably seen things about WMI event subscriptions, WMI filters, things like this used for persistence. We don't get into that as much. Some of these, the 58, 57 log, I think can possibly use for some of the some of the WMI filters and event subscriptions. In this case, it basically gives us an indicator that something is happening over WMI, something fishy is happening in this neighborhood, and 4624, again, is going to indicate a network logon and a service logon, 3 and 5. So hopefully by now you've seen a trend. If you are not, if you're not catching 4624 events, if you're not collecting those, now would be the time. One of the talks that I'm ended up citing in this session is something from Michael Go, where he talked about the sexy 6 of log collection, the 6 events that will kind of keep you covered for most of your detections. 4624 for these logons, your service one, and we're going to talk about another one as well, that are all part of those 6 that he says, all right, this should be your bare minimum. If you're using an EDR product or Sysmon, no matter how a WMI process gets spawned, it should always come out of WMI PRVSE. There are many ways to spawn processes via WMI. You can do it through PowerShell. You can do it through odd commands like winrm lets you do an invoke create process. There's a few other different ways. The way we see most common is simply the WMI command, and the /node will indicate that I want a command to run on somebody else's system. Here's the system to run on. So no matter if it's WMI or it's something else, it should always come out of WMI PRVSE. So let's take a look at and then the live forensics, there's not really as much because it really depends on what the system is doing. There's not really an indicator so far other than just gathering up some of the logs that I can tell that WMI has done something odd. PowerShell Remoting. The other one I believe somebody had mentioned earlier, I think it was in Paul's talk earlier, talking about script block logging. 4104 events will let you know that something suspicious has happened in PowerShell. It's not something that's turned on by default. You have to upgrade to PowerShell 5, go turn this on, and be able to see what is happening in your environment. The really cool thing about this, if you've ever seen Daniel Bohannon's Invoke Obfuscation project, some of the obfuscation will get stripped out before it is recorded to this log. Not all of it. If you look at the backticks and all this stuff, that sort of stuff will get pulled out. The token-based obfuscation will not. So, this might make things a little bit easier if you have some lazy bad guys. Network logon type 3. And when we start looking at what processes are doing things, child processes should spawn from WSM provhost.exe. This is kind of an interesting one as well. Let's imagine that you're PowerShell remoting and you stay in your PowerShell session instead of spawning other commands. All of the activity occurs within that WSM provhost process. So you may have WSM provhost. Let's say that you use invoke mimikatz in it or something like that. That WSM provhost is going to be doing all the activity that you would expect of invoke mimikatz. However, if you spawned the mimikatz process itself, it would be a child process of WSM provhost. Sender processes are typically going to be PowerShell.exe or PWSH.exe. Does anybody know the significance of PWSH? Yep, PowerShell version 6. Somebody's been paying attention to Microsoft lately. And then the live forensics for Windows remote management as a whole really relies on heavy and mature log processing. If you don't have logs in place, you're going to be really struggling with this because you have to figure out a way to tell your admin activity from your bad guy activity. If you start going, okay, this file was written and it looks weird, it was at this time, and you have your admin going, yeah, I was logged on at that time, you're going to have a lot of trouble figuring out the different threads, pulling out the right needles. Process execution artifacts like prefetch, amcache, things like that can help out. It just depends on the case. And something that is not necessarily, I don't believe it's default, PowerShell transcripts. If you have PowerShell transcripts turned on and you collect them, you can see a lot more about what people type in there in your environment. You can see a lot more things about it. So for remote desktop management, because we can't always sit at a desk in front of our computer, they gave us admin with a GUI for remote desktop. It's the service everybody's familiar with. It sits and it listens on port 3389, and it lets you share clipboard, printers, disks, copy and paste, like live, everything. And it's, of course, the service that made Citrix famous, unfortunately. Get all this stuff going with it. And it's used for a desktop experience. If you have admins, especially newer admins, who aren't familiar using RSAT tools, things like that, and they just want to go to a server and figure out what's going on, they're going to hit remote desktop because they don't know how to use the other tools yet. So for log information, the basic one, again, 4624. This time we have different log types, logon types. We have logon type 10 or 7. So people are usually familiar with logon type 10. Does anybody know what 7 is? Unlock, yeah. So that's what happens when you come back to your PC, boop, unlock, and back to the session. 1149 will tell you that a successful remote desktop session has connected. It'll tell you, here's my user account, here's where I'm coming from, and that's about it. If you happen to be looking in EDR, there's a couple of processes to be concerned with. Your receiving host that is letting you log in should always have an RDP clip process. I tested this out. Even if you disable your clipboard sharing, it should still have RDP clip. So if you want to tell whether or not you have a sysadmin logging on off hours, something like that, you should be able to go look at RDP clip. It always spawns in the user context of the person that's logging on. You can see what's going on. The sender process for remote desktop is usually MSTSC. There's some other remote desktop processes, but if you have somebody that's sticking fairly closely to Microsoft stuff, they'll probably be using this. So a little bit more. That's the activity when you tend to do the log on, the connection part of things. What happens when you do the actual interaction in a session? Because you're provided a shell, you have a full desktop experience, everything is going to appear as normal, just like you're sitting down at the system. So if you're looking from an EDR sysmon perspective, when you go look for parent processes, odd activity, you're going to see the same thing as somebody with an interactive session, explorer.exe, command, and some of this also depends on how you're presenting remote desktop. If you happen to be using like a terminal server or something like that that has a really controlled shell, things will look a little bit different to you, but it's going to still look like somebody has just logged in as executing. For live forensics, you can tell that RDP clip has been executing from prefetch parsing if you have prefetch enabled, and be able to tell from some of the user activity just like you would from a local logon. The catch is, it's just not interactive, it's remote. And so I know some of you are probably interested in Bluekeep. We're not going to talk about it in this one, we're going to talk about it in just a minute, but this one we're going to talk about tunneling. So every now and then we get something interesting from folks about tunneling remote desktop services, and the two ones we've kind of seen most often so far tend to come from somebody using PuTTY's plink or the netshell netsh process to do port proxies. These do not get commonly used by legitimate things to start proxying remote desktop traffic. This is something that's going to be pretty high fidelity in most environments. If you happen to be doing live forensics and you want to see this in registry form, there's a registry key for this. If you look for the services port proxy registry keys, you'll see all of the port proxies that have been configured for your system. It doesn't just include remote desktop. You can also catch some other things by looking for this key. If you have somebody that's forwarding SSH traffic or something else through this host and using a port proxy functionality, it'll be in there. And that covers the netsh part. It's probably not going to cover the p-link part. The p-link part you're going to have to look for from live forensics. You're going to have to look for it from a prefetch perspective because p-link's unique. Another one we commonly get, pass the hash. So what is pass the hash? Pass the hash lets you use not a clear text password, but something that's just a password hash, NTLM hash, to authenticate to a system and spawn a process. This is built into some tools like Mgmt. It is trivially easy for somebody to use it on a network that's a little bit older than modern. And if your network happens to be a little bit of one of those, or you happen to have an enclave somewhere that's a little bit older than modern, chances are this could work in your environment too. The awesome thing about Windows 10, some of the newer systems, everything that you need to mitigate this is already built into Windows 10, and it's been in it for a few years. You know, it's something that you can go home. Maybe you don't want to turn it on immediately and go out on a Friday or something like that. You want to test it out a little bit first, but it's something that's definitely possible to do. The key to detecting pass the hash is going to be in your logs. And I'll show why in a second. We're going to look for a special privilege logon of type 3 or 9. The type 3 is network again. The 9 is a unique instance. 9 usually only happens when you do some sort of run as command and you specify network only to go with that run as command. Happens to be that, pass the hash also kicks this up. So if you're looking for those logon types, you'll probably find something at least very interesting. The activity that you find is not going to be a domain logon. You're going to look for something, filter out the domain logons, and you're going to filter out anonymous logon accounts. So once you kind of put these criteria together, you'll find something. ID 10 for Sysmon. This is another one that I added in kind of the last minute because I saw some interesting research where somebody posted that if you have Sysmon in your environment, of course with pass the hash, to make pass the hash work, your compromise tool like Mimikatz, something else, is going to have to, your compromise tool is going to have to do some code injections into lsas.exe. So to do that, has to do a process access. If you happen to be looking for process accesses with Sysmon, you can track it down fairly easily. EDR tools, don't know the difference. If you're just doing some form of process metadata and process monitoring, EDR doesn't care because all they know is a valid user is logged on, valid user issued a process, that's all I care about. From the live forensics perspective, you got to grab the logs if you don't already have them in a SIM or you don't have them in some sort of aggregation point. If you get really lucky, bad guys may leave Mimikatz or some of their credential theft tools on disk. They may leave memory dumps on disk. It just depends on your bad guy and how sloppy the bad guys get. The key is to do pass the hash. They're probably going to be using something similar to Mimikatz. So exploitation remote services. This is when we get to talk about things like eternal blue and bluekeep. So what is eternal blue and all of this mess? Eternal blue is SMB execution, SMB exploitation. SMB is going to be the typical server message block. It's going to be the protocol that Windows uses to talk to one another on the network. If you have a file server somewhere, that file server is definitely going to use SMB, unless you're running on Linux, NFS, and all that mess. So, SMB is very, very common on all sorts of Windows networks. It's used for all sorts of things, from domain, file servers, all this different mess. So Eternal Blue was one really common exploit that we've seen in the past to let bad guys move from one system to another and get really privileged system access. If you're not used to the term system access, this is going to be one level above administrator. This is who administrator has to ask permission to, quite literally. System does not require UAC, do not pass go, they just go on through. So the other exploit we can kind of talk about is bluekeep. If you've been keeping up with the news, bluekeep was this new kind of network traffic manipulation sort of thing that lets you either crash servers or execute code. But if you don't execute code, it definitely crashes the server. So you got one or the other. If you have logs, it really depends on the exploit that you got. Exploits are very unpredictable animals. Some exploits may give you logs, some may not. If you have sysmon, you'll have some of the same rules as EDR in a second. If you have sysmon looking for code injection, you can sometimes find code injection coming with, coming from exploit binaries to legitimate system binaries, depending on how things work. Every exploit's a little bit different. Your tools to find Bluekeep are going to be a little bit different than internal blue. So from the EDR perspective, most of the time to find exploit activity like this, we have to look for abnormal parent-child relationships. These are going to be things like you don't expect to run, you don't expect lsas.exe to have a child process or the principler to have a child process. This is typically what we look for with Eternal Blue and Bluekeep, respectively. Eternal Blue, if you look at the default options in Metasploit, Eternal Blue has lsas.exe as its default sort of injection target for you to inject things into. If you look at the Bluekeep RCE in Metasploit, Spool SV is going to have that as the default as well. Both of these processes typically don't spawn command shells, they don't spawn scripts, they don't spawn things that would really indicate that somebody is trying to run another command. Usually if LSAS or principler are going to be doing anything that's going to be doing something to do with like a policy management tool or a print driver. Outside of those tools, if it's a child process of this, something's funky is kind of going on. And your live forensics is really going to depend on if you have a memory snapshot or if you have a sloppy bad guy. If you have a memory snapshot, you typically get some code injection using malfind, some sort of plugin with volatility. If you have a sloppy bad guy, you might be able to find their exploit binaries that have been left over. It just depends on them. Sometimes bad guys fire and forget, and they just leave everything on the system and never delete it, and we'll take that. The last one I wanted to cover was remote services. Usually on Windows, if people are moving around using remote services and not just exploiting them, they're going to be using SMB. However, this also happens on Mac and Linux systems. SSH, VNC, we have these things for management on Windows, on Linux and Mac systems. So hopefully nobody has VNC with no password or something like that going in their environment. It happens to everybody. These are services that are designed typically for remote management. Sometimes they're not. It just depends on a use case. When it comes to a bad guy, they're going to use this as malicious management. They don't care what you're using it for. They're just going to barrel on through. The logs really depend on the service. So for your SMB accesses, you'll be able to tell like network share accesses, things like that we talked about earlier. On the Linux side of the house, you're going to be looking for these two logs, varlog secure and varlog auth, depending on your brand of server. Just looking for SSH logs. Something that Tim Carruthers pointed out this morning, that if you watch his talk, he's also got some locations for Mac OS logs showing SSH authentications. So definitely, when all the videos are posted, go back and watch that one. From the EDR perspective, the lateral movement, the stuff that's being executed by bad guys, are going to come off of SSH daemons and VNC daemons. These are the ones that are listening for network connections on your system. Sometimes you're not going to be able to tell much of a difference between your admin and the bad guy because your admin issuing an SSH command is going to look the same as the bad guy. What you have to look for is, things that have really suspicious command lines. And when you ask, what does a suspicious command line look like? It looks like that. Bad guys can't be that stupid. Yes, they are. Something that we've seen on several campaigns is cryptojacking, resource hijacking attacks for Linux. They'll go and look at the authorized hosts files that are associated with a Linux system. And of course, that authorized host file is populated whenever we have a successful SSH connection. You type in YES, I want to save this, don't ask me again. And your bad guy will enumerate that file, see who you've talked to, and try to issue a command like this to the other ones. It's very sinister if you have like SSH authorized keys, stuff like that already set up. This stuff will spread around in your environment if you have key-based authentication, and you'll never know it until you have a bunch of servers mining on you. From the live forensics perspective, it's going to be recovering logs. Typically, this SSH stuff is going to be logging by default unless you turn it off for some reason. So the logs are definitely going to be there. It's ideal to ship them out. If you can't ship them out anywhere, just go and collect them. You're going to look for file system artifacts that are correlated with your logon times. Go look at your logon timestamps and see, some of your file timestamps that have changed during that time, and see if you can recover any shell history. Bash and other shells on Mac OS and Linux will keep a history of the commands that you've typed interactively. Something that people don't realize is that commands like less also do as well. So if you happen to have a bad guy who's using less to look through all the files on a system, they'll be leaving a history file for that as well when they start typing commands. Let's say they want to search for super secret project and your text file, that's going to be left in a history file. So that's all I really have. I want to give a special thanks to everybody that contributed to this because we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. And I'm going to open it up for questions. All right. That works. So, I guess do a couple of give outs. The first one is Tribe of Hackers by Marcus Carey and Jennifer Jin. So, let's see, let's do a trivia. What is a malware family that uses Windows admin shares to move around? It's really common, uses document macros, it's in the news. Who said Emotet? Yeah, I knew you'd say Emotet. All right. So this one is wide range AC 1200 wireless adapter. So let's see. Trying to think of a good one. Let's see. I can't think of any more malware families off the top of my head. All right. First best question wins this. First best question, the first one. Oh. No, these guys are messing with me because I work with them. All right, I can't give the product to you. 4625, that's going to be a logon ID, but I can't remember. So you played Stump the Chump and you won. All right, so there you go. Always go with Stump the Chump, man. I like that. Log off event. All right, sweet. Oh, yeah, the reason I'm wearing a flamingo shirt is because I forgot I was going to be recorded. Yeah, wrong bird. All right. Any other questions? Anything that anybody wants to talk about? Yes, sir. So say that last little part again about... Yeah. So the key-based authentication part, the reason I specified key-based authentication is because when you look at some of the campaigns, like I believe one threat actor, Rock, as well as a few others that use pastebin to sort of hold their scripts while they're walking around the environment, they don't know what passwords to specify in their scripts. They have no idea that you're going to have credentials on the system. They're just going to give it a shot in the dark and see if it works. So they're making an assumption. You know what it does for everybody. They're making the assumption that you're going to have an authorized host and that you're going to have an authorized key to that host. If you don't have an authorized key to the host, your lateral movement isn't going to work. So that's the only reason I specified the authorized key part. Does it make sense? Yeah, we can talk about it more offline in just a bit. Anything else? All right, sweet. Have a good day, guys.